Hello everyone, this video will go along with the document that I put under the Writings tab for this week's module. I did this because I know some students learn better by actually hearing and seeing, so I'm going to go through this briefly. However, I do recommend that you read over this document first because I think it will help you better understand, because I am going to move rather quickly through this. So the first thing we need to talk about are the four types of sentences. And over here we have simple sentences. Simple sentences basically are independent clauses. An independent clause has to have three things. It has to have, let me go back up here, a subject, a verb, and it has to be a complete thought. If we go back down here, a simple sentence, for example, Tom walks. It has a subject, Tom, and a verb, walks. Tom walks. Does that make sense? Is it a complete thought? Yes. Therefore, this is a simple sentence. You can read this over a little more in detail. I'm going to go to compound sentences. In English, we have three ways to create a compound sentence. The first way is probably the most common. We take an independent clause, we add a coordinating conjunction, and then we add another independent clause. They are held together or joined by the coordinating conjunction. Most of you may not know coordinating conjunction, however, you may know them as fanboys. So the fanboys are here. Read through those. The example here is Kevin loves coffee, comma, and Sydney loves tea. Here, Kevin loves coffee is the first independent clause because it can stand alone. If I were to put a period here instead of the comma, Kevin loves coffee, it has a subject, it has a verb, and Kevin loves coffee makes sense. So we know that this is an independent clause. If we go over here and just look at Sydney loves tea, let's forget about the beginning of this sentence. So Sydney is the subject, loves is the verb. Sydney loves tea. It makes complete sense on its own. Therefore, this is an independent clause. So what we've done here is joined this independent clause and this independent clause together with a comma and, which is the coordinating conjunction. That is the first way to make a compound sentence. The second way is we're going to change the middle. Instead of having a fanboys in the middle, now we're going to use a semicolon, conjunctive adverb, comma. Let's use the same example that we used before. Kevin loves coffee, comma, but Sydney loves tea. That's the first way. Now we're going to change the comma but to semicolon, however, comma. Kevin loves coffee, semicolon, however, comma, Sydney loves tea. Again, these two sentences have the same meaning. We just changed the joining words. So we have our first way and our second way. The third way to create a compound sentence is to simply add independent clause, semicolon, independent clause. Let's take a look. Kevin loves coffee, semicolon, Sydney loves tea. This is the third way to create a compound sentence. However, if you use a semicolon, make sure the independent clause and the other independent clause have a strong relationship, because there are no clue words like but or however to help the reader understand the relationship between the two. So if you're going to use a semicolon, make sure they are closely related. Both independent clauses are closely related. Next, we're going to go to complex sentences. Complex sentences are complex because they're more complicated. Now we're going to throw in a dependent clause plus an independent clause. Let's take a look at this example. Although Kevin loves coffee, comma, Sydney loves tea. Here, by adding the subordinator although, I have made this sentence here, this part, although Kevin loves coffee, dependent, because if it were by itself, although Kevin loves coffee, it doesn't make sense. It needs more information. So it needs help, and that help comes from Sydney loves tea, which is the independent clause. So we have the dependent clause, although Kevin loves coffee, comma, and then we have the independent clause, Sydney loves tea. Notice that we put a comma between the dependent clause and the independent clause. However, we can also switch these and put the independent clause first. Here, if we put the independent clause first, no comma is necessary, and then put the dependent clause at the end. Let's take a look at the sentence. Here we go. Here's a new example. Before Kevin and Sydney taught their classes, comma, Kevin, oh, I jumped, excuse me for a second. Sorry about that, I'm going to jump back. Here is the example I was looking for. This time I'm putting Sydney loves tea, the independent clause, and then although Kevin loves coffee, the dependent clause. Notice that I don't have a comma before although. It is optional here. I don't use it because I have the word although as my transition word, so the reader knows I'm going from an independent clause into a dependent clause. The last type of sentences are the compound complex sentence. Here we have a compound sentence, and now we've added a complex sentence or a dependent clause. Let's take a look at the example. Before Kevin and Sydney taught their classes, comma, this is the dependent clause. Before is a subordinator. Then I joined it with two independent clauses. Kevin had some coffee, comma, and Sydney had some tea. This is a compound sentence because we have independent clause, fanboys, another independent clause. So this compound sentence is joined to this dependent clause, thus making it a compound complex sentence. It is important to know these sentence types because it will help you prevent having run-ons or comma splices. I want to mention that some books call run-ons fused sentence. I usually use the term run-ons, but run-ons and fused are the same thing, just different names. So let's go through here and we'll give some examples. First of all, a run-on is no punctuation between two independent clauses. Let's look here. Kevin loves coffee, Sydney loves tea. Independent clause, no punctuation. This writer has run on and on and on and hasn't used punctuation. That's wrong. We cannot do that. Next, let's go to a comma splice. Here, we're going to use the same example. Kevin loves coffee, comma, Sydney loves tea. Here we have Kevin loves coffee, independent clause, Sydney loves tea, independent clause. The writer here is trying to use a comma to hold together these two independent clauses. However, the comma is too weak. It cannot do this job alone. It needs help. So the next thing I'm going to go through, I'm going to show you the ways to correct both run-ons and comma splices because you fix them the same way. So let's come down here. I'm going to use the same sentences that we've used before. The sentence is, Kevin loves coffee, punctuation missing, Sydney loves tea. Since there's no punctuation between these two independent clauses, again, this is a run-on. Next, comma splice. Kevin loves coffee, comma, Sydney loves tea, comma. Here, independent clause, again, this comma is too weak to hold together the two independent clauses. So let's go ahead and fix them. The first way we can fix them is turn this into a simple sentence, two simple sentences. Kevin loves coffee, period. Sydney loves tea, period. Now we have two simple sentences and they are both correct. Number two, the second way to fix it. Turn it into the first way to make a compound sentence. Kevin loves coffee, comma, but Sydney loves tea. Here, we used a fanboy to join them. The third way we can correct these two errors, instead of using but, let's go to however, the conjunctive adverb, which would lead us to the second way to make a compound sentence. And then the last way we could correct these is by using not the last way, but one of the other ways, the fourth way we could fix these is by using the semicolon. If you've noticed, this is the third way to create a compound sentence. And then the last way we could do is create a complex sentence. Take one of these, Kevin loves coffee, which is an independent clause, add a subordinator, therefore making this a dependent clause, then add the comma and the independent clause, therefore We have dependent clause, comma, independent clause. We have now made this a complex sentence. So, if you know how to create the sentence types, you will know how to avoid comma splices or run-ons. However, when you're editing your papers, if you do see a run-on or a comma splice, here are 5 ways in order to fix them. Again, I hope this video helps. You can also read over this lecture that I have under the writing for this module, for this week's module. If you have any questions, email me. Okay, take care.